Um, I want to begin this morning. It's always a bad thing at 9 o'clock on a rainy Saturday morning to begin with a question, but I'm gonna ask a question this morning, and if you would give this some thought over the next few minutes, and we'll come back to this question. I'm going to begin by asking this question: what makes biblical New Testament leadership, as we read of and as we follow it from the New Testament, what makes that unique? What makes that different from any other leadership that you may be familiar with or that you may have been a part of? What makes biblical New Testament leadership unique?
It's not me, me, me. And in leadership, it's always think of I first and then you move on.
Okay, well, good one, good one, good one. Be giving some thought to that. We'll come back to that in just a bit. I want to introduce myself. Andrew, he said, "Do you want to introduce yourself, or do you want me to?" And I just told him part of my introduction kind of leads into the material, so I told him I'd take care of that. I I begin by saying I'm an eighth generation Arkansan. And if you know anybody from Arkansas, they have a terrible inferiority complex about Texas. And so that goes back to Arkansas, Texas football back in the 60s and 70s and maybe the early 80s. And I'm one of those guys. But I have to tell you, I'm growing. I've worked down here some and been down here several times in the last year or so, and I'm growing to appreciate Texas. I have some Texas cousins. If they heard me say that, they would really give me some grief. So I am from Central Arkansas. My wife and I are called Conway our home. That's just north of Little Rock, a little ways. We've we lived there for about 10 years. Both of us grew up in that community, and we've lived there most of our lives, and we call that home. I'm a fifth generation minister. I took a little bit of an inordinate path to ministry. If you, my formal bio is in the handouts that you have, and so I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but I do want to share the beginning of the ministry that I'm involved in now. I spent about 43 years in the professional work. Did a lot of primarily in IT work and owner construction project management. And I was working about the last 10 years or so. I've essentially worked for myself. I've been an independent contractor. A lot of my work has been with banks, and so January of 24, the first week of each year, I sit down and ask myself a few questions. It's usually an exercise that lasts maybe a morning. And I asked myself, how did the previous year go? Did I meet the goals that I had both professionally and personally? Did I grow spiritually? Where am I at this point in time? And as I said, most years that was a pretty quick exercise. I'd come up with a few things that I thought I needed to change or I needed to do a little bit better. And in 2024, it was a little bit different. I spent a couple of days just really soul searching and asking myself, do I really want, well, a little bit of background. I had a bank that I was working with in Columbus, Mississippi, and they were really eager for me to help them figure out how they were going to use artificial intelligence to make their customers' processes better, to make the bank operate more efficiently. And they came to me and they said, we want you to figure out artificial intelligence and help us go through that. And so those two days there in January of 24, I started asking myself, do you really want to learn this? Do you really want to spend time learning something that late in your career, you really don't have an interest in it. And in the back of my mind, I kept asking myself the question, what am I doing? Am I doing what I need to do for God? Am I doing what I need to for his church? Am I doing what I need to for myself and my family spiritually? And that just continued to churn in the back of my mind. Have spent about 22 years serving as an elder, as a deacon early in my life. Spent 10 years serving as an elder at a congregation in Bologna, Arkansas, which is my hometown. And that congregation was a church plant that my family and I were involved in. There were 9 families that left a church in Conway to start a church in Bologna. There'd never been a Church of Christ in the city of Bologna. Some nearby, some great congregations nearby, one of which I grew up in. But there had never been one in Bologna. And so we launched out in November of 2007 and planted the church in Bologna, which today is a thriving church of 125 or really was a joy to be a part of that. I've spent most of my life being what I call a tent maker. Paul made tents and made his own living while he was preaching and teaching and establishing churches in the New Testament. When I was about 22 or 3, I began thinking about, as a 5th generation minister, at that time I was considering that. And I was asking myself, what do you want to do this the rest of your life? And my grandmother, who was the daughter and granddaughter of preachers, she'd raised some, was the sister to one. I went and talked to her and I asked her, what do you think about this? I'm struggling. I have a professional career that I want to pursue, but I feel the call to preach. And she told me something that day that was really life changing for me. She was a woman with a 4th grade education, very intelligent woman, very smart in a lot of ways, way beyond her education. And she said, well, son, let me tell you, if you can do anything else but preach, and I thought I'd heard that saying before, and I thought she was going to say, do it. And Granny said, if you can do anything else in the world except preach, do both. And I said, okay. And so I had spent a lot of my life teaching and preaching, but I've never done that on a full-time basis until January of this year. I began preparing in mid-2024 to go into this work, developing some of the material that we're going to go through today, several other sets of material. And so that gives you a little bit of a background as to who I am and why I feel passionate about leadership. I was blessed as a boy. Some of you may be preacher's kids. I don't know. If you're a preacher's kid, you grow up with some challenges and some real deep rewards. The challenges I won't get into, but the rewards, part of the rewards were I always knew the elders that my dad worked for. I considered a lot of them. Years ago, I made a list of those. There's about 42, I think, different elders that my dad worked with as a local minister, local preacher. And a lot of them I was really close to. And so I watched them and I learned from them and I began to understand a little bit about leadership, just as a boy, watching them lead. And then as I got older and was a young deacon, I worked with a great group of elders, actually two great groups, 2 different congregations where I served as deacon. And so I used their model. I was able to eventually lead myself, and that provided me with some great experience as an elder for about 10 years there in Bologna. And so I felt passionate about leadership all my life. My professional job role has often involved leadership. And so Bob Turner and I have talked over the last year or so. There is a real crisis in the church today, a real crisis of leadership. And I'd go beyond the church. There's a real crisis of leadership culturally right now. You look at the division that exists in our society and our culture. You look at the problems that we have with families, with individuals dealing with personal issues, and there's just so little leadership in our world today. And so I feel passionately about that. I want today to be very conversational. I want it to just be very laid back and very informal. Will conversation may lead us away from what I have planned, and that's okay. That's a good thing. I love it when that happens. I'm very flexible, very adaptable. I'm not one of those guys that I've got a set of material here, a defined set of material that we're going to go through. I want this to be very conversational and help us all understand some things about leadership. One question I want to ask, everybody get a handout. Everybody got, if you don't, there's one extra up here. So, okay. I want to give you just a real brief mention about mission evangelism. That is the ministry that I'm a part of. Back in 1991, my father left local preaching work and began preaching gospel meetings. I think he's preached in 39 states over his lifetime. He's still active, still preaching at 85. He's in his 66th year of preaching. Began when he was 19 up in northern Indiana. And so he left local work and began doing mission work. In 1995, I had an uncle, my dad's brother, who had done several years of work in Romania. And he was pestering my father to go with him and do some work there. And Dad told him, I'll go with you one time just to get you off my back and leave, so you'll leave me alone. And I think Dad has been to Romania 56 times over the last 30 years or so. My late mother, we lost my mom to Alzheimer's disease in October of 22. She went on most of those trips with him. And so we are working with a church in northern Romania. I'm working with 4 different churches right now. And I'll be spending a good bit of the summer in Romania. Our work is sponsored by the Levy Church of Christ in North Little Rock. That was one of the churches where my dad preached when I was a boy. And so we've had a long 60-year relationship with the Levy congregation, and they are our sponsors, and we're so appreciative of them. I'm also doing these type workshops on I'm hoping about 20 weeks a year in the future to spend doing the leadership workshops. I have a workshop on generational and cultural challenges. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the morning in Bible class. And so I'll give you a kind of an introduction to some of that work that I'm doing. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the material today. My hometown in Bologna, Bologna is straight north of Little Rock, just outside Conway. In April 25th of 2011, the city was hit by an EF2 tornado. We were in the path of that tornado. My wife and I, our younger daughter was still at home getting ready to marry in June of that year. As a matter of fact, when we took shelter in the laundry room, her dad was standing out in the yard and was waiting for the tornado to come over the hill and scare him half to death. Let me tell you, if you've ever stared a tornado down face to face, if you're one of those guys that says, I'm going to stand out in the yard and see this thing, you'll do it once. You may not do it a second time. Let me tell you. Kendall, she wasn't worried about her dad out in the yard. She ran and got her wedding dress and was going to hold that while the tornado went by because she'd worked hard picking that wedding dress out. We had a little bit of damage to our home. Had to replace all the flooring and some ceilings and roof, and it was a mess. And 3 years and 2 days later, April 27th, 2014, a second tornado came through Bologna. Missed us for about 400 yards, came on a very similar path, and it was debated as to whether or not it was a low-end EF5 or a high-end EF4. The National Weather Service couldn't find quite enough evidence to give it an EF5, which would have been Arkansas's second EF5. The only other one was in 1929. And my wife and I huddled in the closet and listened to that thing go by. And let me tell you, the first one was a high-pitched whistle as it went by. It was just a wind noise. And I thought, tornadoes don't sound like trains. You hear that all the time. They don't sound like trains. Well, let me tell you, a real tornado sounds exactly like a train, and it feels like it's going to come right through the wall at you. I got involved with the city. We lived in a city of about 4,000. The city officials were overwhelmed with just trying to put things back together. The entire business district had been destroyed. 9 people had lost their lives. They were just trying to clean up debris and survive. And a couple of months, 2 or 3 months went by, and I was having a conversation with a good friend who's a civic leader there. He's very involved on the planning commission, a lot of things like that. And he said, you know what we need is somebody just got to get everybody together and figure out how we're going to resolve all this. What are we going to do? How are we going to rebuild our town? And so I went to the mayor and said, look, I want to have a meeting. If it's okay with you and the council, I want to have a meeting and just do hey, everybody over here. Let's gather up. We thought we'd have 40 or 50 people show up. We had 700 people show up one evening, just to say we're in. We want to help. We want to figure out how to help our town become something greater than it was before. I was asked to lead an effort with the authority given to us by the mayor and the city council, a grassroots effort to rebuild Bologna. As a matter of fact, that was the name of the committee, Rebuild Bologna. And so I got very involved with that. I got involved with FEMA and a lot of different federal, state, and local county level organizations. Got way more involved than I should have. And it really took on a life of its own. And we're very proud of the work that we did as a group. We presented a plan for moving forward to the city council on the 1-year anniversary of the tornado. And they're still using that today as their guide to rebuild the community. In 2016, I was asked to go to Joplin, Missouri. They were what would you call it? I guess commemorating the 2012, I think it was, maybe in 2011. It was 2011 tornado that was an EF5. It moved a 350 bed hospital off its foundation, shifted that building, 350 bed, enormous building, shifted it 1 degree off its foundation. I can't get my head around that. I can't get, something in nature moving something so big and so substantial. I was asked to serve on some panels and question and answer kind of things and do some presentations on the work that we'd done in Bologna. They did some similar work in Joplin and Hutchinson, Kansas, Birmingham, Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Alabama. There were a number of communities represented, leaders from those communities. And one evening, we had dinner with a couple of gentlemen who wrote this book, You're It. Lenny Marcus was one of those individuals. The other was Barry Dorn. And it was fascinating. I've got a copy of the book up here if you'd like to get some information out. It's a fascinating read. This group of guys, they're all affiliated with Harvard and MIT. Really smart guys. Just remarkable, some of the work that they did. They eventually formed the National Public Leadership Institute. I believe I got that name right. And they have done a tremendous amount of study about leadership in crisis moments. They looked at a number of specific events, Hurricane Katrina, the BP oil spill down in the Gulf, Boston Marathon bombing. They looked at a number of those crisis situations and for the express purpose of determining how did leaders respond? How were these events managed? And for the next 30 minutes or so, as we dive into this material about what they refer to as meta leadership, and we're going to get to the definition of that really quickly, it became apparent that in those circumstances, leadership just happens in a very uncoordinated, unintentional way. It just develops. It just happens. And as I was sitting there at dinner talking to those guys and picking their brain a little bit, in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, meta leadership is church leadership. And we're going to explore that in depth today, and I hope it's enlightening to you. I hope we can uncover some things that might be helpful to this congregation, to each of your congregations, as we talk about leadership in our churches. I want to go back to that question and ask you: New Testament biblical leadership, what makes that different from other types of leadership?
Well, it's prescribed by God.
Okay, it's divine in nature, right? It's authorized by God. So it's we have a divine directive to practice leadership in that way. What else?
Christ is the head.
What's that?
Christ is the head.
Christ is the head.
You're talking about a business as leadership and comparing it to leadership of the church. Is that right?
You can. Yeah.
What the difference between the two? That's
Yeah.
your question, right?
Yeah.
Well, your soul.
What's that?
Well, in business, it's monetary, worldly thing that you're trying to gain. You got to be moving forward. What's the end goal? Well, in the church situation, it's your soul. And what you're here after is being hereafter.
Right. That's great. That's one of the things I'm looking for is church leadership is not like business leadership. What if you've ever been or you're part of a business leadership team right now, what's your goal? Right. Making money, right? Now, some of us may be involved in businesses where we do good for the public, and that's great. And there may be admirable objectives for an organization that's being led, but the objective of a worldly organization is not making sure people go to heaven. That's what sets New Testament biblical leadership apart from leadership in the world, an organization in the world, is we have one objective, and that is to, if you look in the book of Ephesians, the church has two purposes: to bring glory to God and to tell others, to teach others. That's the reason the church exists, is to bring glory to God and to reach lost souls. There's not many businesses that I can think of that have similar objectives to that. As I said, you may work for a company that has a very good purpose, very honorable purpose, but it's not that. Think about those leadership teams in companies today. What makes them different from church leadership? What up? What up?
In business, they're each climbing to get to the top,
Okay.
as opposed to the church or not. That's
They're different. The structure's different, right?
We're kind of climbing to get to the bottom, trying to be servants.
There you go. It's upside down, isn't it? It's upside down. You know, if you've been involved in working with a big company and you've interacted with, or you've even been a member of a leadership team in a big company, you know, the objective, it gets very political, doesn't it? It gets very, you've got all these things that you want to do. You want to climb that ladder. You want to, you know, I'm always amused, and the older I get, the more amused I am at individuals who have that desire to be at the top. They want to run the company. I've known a few like that. And it seems to consume them. And you know, the desire there is to be at the top, where we as a church, those of us who are in leaderships in churches, what are we searching for? We're searching for ways to serve. We're looking at for ways to what is, you know, Jesus said the least of you will be the greatest. And so it's a little bit upside down. One other thing I want us to think about is leaders in those organizations are often very highly trained for the specific purpose that they are in. I have a son-in-law who's a chief financial officer of the local utility in Conway. He's a CPA, certified public accountant, he's certified financial analyst. He spent his entire early days professionally and his entire education preparing himself to lead an organization financially. He's in his dream job. That's what he's always wanted to do. And he's highly trained for that. He works with guys that are highly trained in information technology. Another one who's highly trained in marketing. So when you look at leadership teams in the worldly organizations, they're often highly trained in a specific field and perhaps even a specific industry. I spent some time working leading a project management office for an electric utility organization in Little Rock. Most of the 60% of that company are electrical engineers. Okay, if you're in a really important role at that company, you know big wood from kindling as it relates to electric industry. You know what you're talking about there. Worldly organizations are often that way. When you think about, and we're going to get to the definition here, I'm just going to jump ahead here for a second. I want to define meta leadership for you. And this is really the heart of this first part of the session this morning. Meta leadership is a framework intended to provide guidance and establish momentum among people with diverse backgrounds who routinely do different work but face a common significant change. There's a couple things I wanted to know here. One is this. Meta leadership teams are made up of people from diverse backgrounds. When I saw this definition back in 2016, they shared this while we were at dinner, and I read that definition. I said, "That's elderships. That's elderships," and here's why: people with diverse backgrounds. The church where Lisa and I call home has 8 elders. One is a retired school teacher. One is an occupational therapist. One is a manager at a gun manufacturing company in Jacksonville, Arkansas. One is a civil engineer, self-employed. Well, I'm running out of one's a retired from oil and gas industry. The list goes on. I won't bore you guys with those details. My point is, those guys are from very diverse backgrounds. They have varying levels of training professionally. They have very different backgrounds as to where they grew up and how they, some of them grew up in little country towns, some grew up in big cities. And so there's diverse backgrounds. This meta leadership is a framework with people from different backgrounds who routinely do very different work. Okay? All those occupations I described, your eldership here may be made up of men from very diverse backgrounds. They don't do the same thing. And they face a common significant challenge. Yes,
Speak for a moment on the importance of male and female roles within both the business world as well as within the church.
right.
There's an importance in both, but it seems to be convoluted within the business world, and we sometimes let that sneak over into the church.
Isn't that a huge issue today? How do we follow God's pattern in the New Testament for the type of leadership that women do? And I'm not talking formal leadership here. I'm talking about the kind of leadership that my grandmother offered to me. Okay. If there had been a way for Desi Knight to be a preacher, she'd have figured it out and would have done it. Okay. It was her passion. And she wasn't put in a station in life where she could do that. So she raised 4. And now she has 6 grandsons out of 19 who are preachers. She adored her father and her grandfather and her brother who preached. I mean, it was just a passion. She couldn't get up in the pulpit and preach, but she was going to help those men around her, those men in her life, do that. She wanted to influence them and lead them to do that. Now, my grandfather's a great Christian man, great leader in his home. But my grandmother possessed some leadership qualities that were invaluable to our family. The fruit is still being born today. So that's a great point. We as a church have to figure out how we're gonna help our women understand their role is invaluable. And they can lead in the home, they can lead other women, they can lead in their families. And that's so valuable. We can't live without that. We must have it. And yet, what does the world say? The world says women are equal to men. And so so many religious groups today are changing to embrace that and leading us away from God's pattern, God's way for women and men in the church. Other thoughts? We'll go back to help us get started for the day. In your handout there, you've got this page. And I'm going to give you a few minutes. I want us to think about this morning. You're it. Okay? Back to the title of this book. You're it. Crisis, change, and how to lead when it matters most. When I saw that book that night back there in May of 2016, and I saw that line, I thought, that's the church. We're always in crisis. The church in the New Testament was in crisis. The church in 1500 was in crisis. The church in 2025 is in crisis. Not in the sense that, you're something's burning down and you got to stop it. But we live in a world that challenges the church. We live in a world led by, from a worldly sense, someone who hates everything about God and everything about his church. And so are we as a church in crisis? You bet we are. Oh, we always are. And as leaders, you're helping people who in the course of their daily lives may be in crisis as well. So when I saw that title, I thought, okay, this is at some point in the future, I'm going to use this and help churches and church leaders and those that aspire to be church leaders understand some of these principles. So I want you to think about this morning your leadership moment. That point in your life where you first recognized my leadership matters. Okay? Prompt your thought process. I'm going to give you mine. When I was about 22, 21 actually, Lisa and I had just decided to marry. We were a few months away from that. I was working my first job. I'd gone to work for this company while I was finishing up college and I was still in school. And I was working with a group of people that 2 or 3 of those individuals are very close friends of mine that I'd grown up with. And suddenly, boss calls me in one day and says, "We think you've got great leadership potential. We want to make you a manager over these 14 people in IT operations running a data center. It's a very noisy environment, and I'm wearing hearing aids, and I still can't hear very well. You may have noticed that. I may come lean into you while I'm listening to you today. Ran that data center, had these 14 people working for me, and I accepted their offer. And then I got home that night, and Lisa and I were making wedding plans, and I'm telling her, boy, this is a great opportunity. It's more money. And then it hit me. You got 14 people depending on you. Some of them my closest friends. And people I've known, most of them since we were boys. And I thought, wow, I've got to, am I ready for this? That was my leadership moment. I still think back on that sometimes because it was that at that moment, I'd always had a boss. I'd never been a boss. I hate that term, but it's easy to describe using that term. So what's your leadership moment? What's that moment in your life? It could be at any point in your life. You could be older than I was. You could be younger than I was, whatever. What's that moment? What's your leadership moment? And then the second one is this. What is your crisis moment? That point in your life where you first realized that your leadership was needed to manage a crisis effectively. Okay? I have a couple that I'm going to mention real quick. One is in January 4th, 1986, I was 22 years old, 23 years old. Lisa and I have been married about 2 years. She was pregnant with our first child. She had developed some issues with blood pressure at about 6.5 months. The doctors were really keeping a close eye on things. She was about 7 weeks away from her due date. She'd been put on bed rest. She calls me at work one night and said, "The doctor wants me to come to the hospital now." 8:30, I leave work. Her sister is staying with her. We load up in the car, all 3 of us, drive like crazy people, 30 miles to Little Rock. The doctor examines her, and he sits this 23-year-old knucklehead down who has no concept of what it means to be a dad. He's barely been a husband. And he says, we're going to deliver this child as fast as we possibly can to save the baby and your wife. I sat sometimes in hospitals, they have these little rooms where they put phones or computers, and doctors, they could kind of step in there. And I got in one of those. I just walked in and just sat down and collapsed. Now, I had my parents and her parents and siblings, and all this kind, I had a lot of family out in the waiting room, but I sat in that room, just me and God. And I prayed, let the whole world live. Okay. First child, wife I'd only been married to a couple of years, love of my life. You talk about getting yourself ready to walk in that room with her. The doctor told me, we've told you some things we're not telling her. And so I had to walk in there and act excited. The baby's on the way, you know, and you talk about crisis leadership. The other one that I'll mention really briefly, in 2018, I started noticing some real unusual behavior in my mother. I couldn't figure out what in the world was going on. She had a knee replacement and had broken a hip in the 2 years preceding that. And I thought, is she on pain meds and it's messing with her mind? And what in the world's going on? So finally, in May of 2019, I went over and sat down with my dad and I said, Dad, there's something going on with Mom. What is it? And he said, well, son, she has Alzheimer's. She's had it for a year. Called my mom in the room. She sat down with me. She was a remarkable woman, not educated. She was incredibly emotionally intelligent. She just had a great intellect, a great mind, and she had a great way of communicating with candor and humor. She just had a way of just disarming any kind of situation with just that combination of candor and humor and honesty. And she sat down by me and I grabbed her by the hand and I said, Mom, Dad tells me you got a problem. She said, son, I'm losing my mind. And I said, I know. And the mind that had done countless good for me, the thought of that going away and my dad losing, they knew each other from the ages of 5 and 7. And at that point in time, they've been married 60 years. And the thought of what he was going through and what my younger sister was, all this swirl of emotions, I thought, that's crisis. And I'm going to have to leave. There's going to be, as the oldest child, the only son, I'm going to have to provide some leadership for my family. It's going to be really tough. So what are your moments there? I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to think about that. What are your moments? We're going to come back to that in just a little bit. So let's take about 5 minutes. If you need to take a final break, feel free to do that. But just give some thought to those questions and just jot down what your answers are, and we'll come back to those a bit later.